In this video, we're going to discuss the difference between the CSS Financial Aid Profile and the FAFSA form. So both of these are financial aid forms, but there's some important differences. So first of all, the CSS Profile is administered by the College Board, whereas the FAFSA is administered by the federal government of the United States. Now, the College Board is going to charge you some money to submit the CSS Profile. You can get a waiver if your family has low income, but the FAFSA form is free for anybody to apply. The CSS Profile is filed earlier, so you can file it as early as October 1st of the year before you plan to attend college, whereas the FAFSA form is filed later. It's filed January 1st of the year you plan to attend. Now, the CSS Profile is not required by all schools, so some universities don't care whether you submit the CSS Profile. Other universities are going to make it mandatory that you submit the CSS Profile. Now, the FAFSA form, pretty much any school that you want to get federal financial aid, you have to fill out the FAFSA. Even if they want the CSS Profile, they're also going to be wanting the FAFSA form as well. Now, the CSS Profile and the FAFSA use different methodologies for determining how much financial aid the student should be eligible for. So the CSS Profile uses what's called the institutional methodology, and it's going to be used to determine how much institutional aid that the college or university gives to the student. And so when we say institutional aid, what we're talking about is grants and scholarships that are given out by the college's own funds, right? The college has money that it can decide what to do with, and that's institutional aid. So it's going to look at the CSS Profile and say, based on that, how much money do we think in need-based grants our college should give to this student? Now, the FAFSA form is going to use the federal methodology to calculate the expected family contribution, or EFC, for the student, which is going to be used to determine how much federal aid that the student is eligible for. Federal aid includes things like the Pell Grant and so forth. So if you're applying to a college that requires the CSS Profile, you're also going to be submitting the FAFSA, and the FAFSA is going to be determining how much in Pell Grant funds and so forth. The CSS Profile is going to be used by the college to determine how much in the college's own funds they decide to give you. Now, because they use different methodologies, I just want to give you a quick rundown on some of the differences. Generally speaking, the CSS is going to get at more types of assets and stuff like that. It's going to dig deeper financially and see how much you can give. Now, the CSS looks at both the custodial and the non-custodial parents' financial information. So that means that if your parents are divorced, for example, the CSS is going to say, hey, we want to see the financial information for the parent you live with. That's the custodial parent. But we also want to see the financial information for the parent you don't live with. That's the non-custodial parent. The FAFSA, however, just looks at information from the parent that you've been living with. So it's not looking at what about the non-custodial parent. The FAFSA doesn't even take that into consideration. This is important if your custodial parent makes a lot less money than the non-custodial parent. You can see if the non-custodial parent is very wealthy, then when you submit the CSS, that's going to kind of hurt your financial position in terms of getting institutional aid from the college. Now, the CSS also might factor in, they might assume when you submit the CSS, the college might assume that you're going to have some summer earnings. And they say, you know what, we think you should be able to make at least $2,000 or $3,000 each summer. We're going to factor that in deciding how much institutional aid we give you. The FAFSA does not assume that the student is going to be working in the summer. It doesn't make any assumptions about that. CSS, when it's looking at assets and different things and the financial position of you and your parents, it's going to take into consideration if you have any home equity, right? So if your parents have built up some home equity, considerable amount of home equity, that's going to make you less likely to be able to get institutional aid, because the college might think that you can get some financing from that. You could take, maybe your parents could take out a home equity loan or something like that. They see this equity as part of your family's financial position. So if they have a lot of home equity, that's a bad thing for you in terms of getting institutional aid. The FAFSA, however, does not look at home equity at all. It doesn't even take that into consideration. Now, The FAFSA has a thing called a simplified needs test. I'll make another video on that. We'll talk, but basically people with certain income, below certain income thresholds, certain qualifications, it won't even look at their assets. It won't even look at the parents' assets if they meet certain qualifications for the simplified needs test. However, the CSS does not have a simplified needs test. It is going to look at all of the assets regardless. They don't have that test to kind of be able to bypass looking at assets. The CSS is also going to look at all and any farm equity. However, the FAFSA will omit some farm equity if there's a couple things going on. So if the family lives on the farm and they materially participate in the operation of the farm, then the FAFSA will not be looking at the farm equity. They won't be taking that in consideration when deciding how much the family's expected family contribution is. Now, business equity, so if let's say one of your parents owns a business, the CSS is going to look at all business equity. They're going to take that all into consideration. The FAFSA, again, is going to be more lenient. It's not going to look at business equity if it's a family-owned business, the family owns more than 50% of the business, and the business has 100 or fewer employees. So you see that the FAFSA is a little bit more lenient in terms of looking at your financial position, and the CSS can be a little more strict, dig a little bit deeper into your financial position, and maybe potentially reduce your aid. But technically, your aid could be higher or lower in terms of what the CSS determines what your contribution is in determining your institutional aid. But regardless of what happens with the CSS and what the CSS determines your aid is or your eligibility is to be able to pay, your wherewithal to pay, ultimately that's not going to affect any of the federal aid from the FAFSA, because the FAFSA and the federal government is going to determine your eligibility for Pell Grants, for SEOG grants, and other federal aid.